When the plate hit the wall beside my head, it didn't shatter completely, just cracked down the middle, the sound slicing the silence between us.
Linda gasped.
Her sister, Claire, stood across the dining table, breathing hard, her eyes burning with the kind of anger that comes from years of unspoken resentment. "You're selfish, Michael," she screamed, her voice trembling. "You only think about yourself."
I didn't move. Didn't even blink.
It's strange how moments like that slow everything down, as if time itself waits to see how you'll respond. The truth is, I didn't feel anger.
Not anymore.
That emotion had burned itself out long before that evening. What I felt instead was finality.
The quiet kind.
Linda tried to grab her sister's arm, but Claire shook her off.
"You've turned him against us," she spat.
"You don't see it, but he's using you, just like he used Dad." Her words hit harder than the plate ever could. Not because they were true, but because they revealed how deep her delusion ran. I looked at her calmly. "Claire," I said softly, "you should go home." She laughed, a bitter, mocking sound.
"Go home?"
"You'd love that, wouldn't you? Get rid of me so you can take everything that's left. The house, the company, even Dad's name. You always wanted to be the hero, Michael.
The perfect son.
The man who fixes everything." I could feel Linda trembling beside me. She hated confrontation. But this wasn't new. Claire's temper had been part of our marriage since the day I said, "I do." She was there at the wedding, standing in the second row, smiling for the pictures, whispering poison between breaths. But that night, the night of the plate, was different. It wasn't just another argument about the family business or the estate. It was the night I realized that silence, patience, and dignity could be sharper than any weapon. I picked up the cracked plate from the floor, wiped it clean with a napkin, and placed it gently on the table. Then I looked at her again. "I think you've said enough," I said quietly.
She scoffed.
"You think you can silence me with your polite little words? You think everyone's blind to what you're doing?"
I didn't respond.
I didn't need to. In that moment, I understood that nothing I said would change her mind. Her rage wasn't about money, property, or fairness. It was about control, the kind she'd lost when her father passed away, leaving the company in both our names. For months, she'd twisted every conversation, turned every family dinner into a battlefield. I'd stayed silent through it all, believing that time would cool her down. But some fires aren't meant to fade, they burn until you stop feeding them. That night when she stormed out, slamming the door behind her, Linda broke down. She sat at the table, face buried in her hands, whispering apologies for her sister's behavior. I placed a hand on her shoulder. "You don't need to apologize," I said. "I think it's time I handle this differently." She looked up, her eyes red. "What do you mean?" I paused, then smiled, not out of spite, but clarity. "I mean I'm going to call Martin in the morning." "Your lawyer?" she asked softly. "Yes." Linda stared at me as if I'd just spoken a foreign language. I'd always been the quiet one, the man who believed in family, who believed that every storm could be waited out. But that night, I realized waiting wasn't peace. It was surrender. When she finally nodded, I knew she understood. It wasn't about revenge. It was about reclaiming dignity, mine, hers, and even what was left of her father's legacy. That night, after she went to bed, I sat alone in the living room. The broken plate still lay on the table, its crack catching the faint light from the lamp. I traced the line with my finger, feeling the rough edge. It reminded me of us, fractured, but not shattered. Outside, the wind moved through the trees, steady and quiet. I thought about how silence had been both my weapon and my prison. And how, tomorrow, it would finally set me free. When I first met Linda's family, I thought I'd walked into one of those picture-perfect households you only see in magazines. The kind with a neatly trimmed lawn, a golden retriever wagging its tail on the porch, and laughter echoing from the kitchen. Her father, Richard, owned a small construction firm that had grown into a regional name. Her mother, Susan, was gracious and soft-spoken, a woman who believed in manners more than emotions. And then there was Claire, the older sister. From the very beginning, Claire made it clear that I was an outsider. She didn't say it directly, of course. She was far too polished for that. But there were moments, long pauses after my jokes, a slight narrowing of the eyes when Linda reached for my hand, questions framed as compliments. "You're in finance, right?" she asked me during my first family dinner. Interesting field. I guess people skills aren't really a requirement there. I smiled. "They're actually essential," I said. She tilted her head, pretending to think. I suppose that depends on what kind of people you're dealing with." Linda laughed nervously and changed the subject. I let it slide. Back then, I thought it was just the normal tension between siblings, the kind of testing that fades once trust is built. But with Claire, trust was never an option. Still, I married Linda a year later, under a sky so clear it felt like a promise. Claire stood beside her, holding the bouquet, smiling for the camera, though even in those photos, if you look closely, you can see something in her eyes. Not sadness. Not jealousy exactly. Something sharper. After the wedding, Linda and I moved into a modest house in the suburbs, just outside Seattle. I loved it, the quiet mornings, the smell of coffee, the way Linda hummed while making breakfast. For the first few months, life was simple. Peaceful. Then her father got sick. It started with fatigue, then more serious symptoms. Within a year, he was gone, leaving behind not just a grieving family, but a company that had been his pride for 30 years. That's when the cracks began to show. Richard had trusted me. Before his passing, he'd asked me to help oversee the company's financial restructuring. He said he valued my judgment, that I understood people, not just numbers. I accepted, thinking I was honoring him. But when the will was read, Claire's composure broke for the first time. "The company is to be managed jointly by my daughter Claire and my son-in-law Michael," the lawyer read. I can still hear the sound of her sharp inhale, like air catching in her throat. After the meeting, she approached me outside. "You must be very proud of yourself," she said quietly. "I didn't ask for this," I replied. "Of course you didn't," she said with a cold smile. "People like you never have to ask." I didn't understand what she meant then. But over time, I did. Claire had always seen the company as her inheritance, her father's validation, her place in the world. And now, suddenly, half of that power rested in the hands of a man she barely tolerated. At first, I tried to work with her. I scheduled meetings, shared reports, asked for her input. Every idea I brought forward, she questioned. Every proposal I made, she delayed. Yet when things went wrong, even when she'd made the call, she found a way to point the finger at me. It wasn't about performance. It was about presence. She couldn't stand that I existed in the same space where she wanted complete control. Linda, caught between us, tried to keep peace. "She's just adjusting," she'd say, placing a hand on my arm. Dad was everything to her. "She'll come around." I wanted to believe that. I truly did. But Claire didn't come around. She circled instead, watching, waiting, finding new ways to remind me that I didn't belong. She'd drop by our house unannounced, criticize how we ran our home, make small remarks that cut deeper than they sounded. "Linda, you've gained a little weight," she'd say, smiling sweetly. "Michael must be keeping you too busy." Or, "This furniture is nice, though a little modest for someone who runs a company, don't you think?" I learned to ignore her. I learned to stay calm. That's what Linda loved about me, my steadiness, my patience. But patience, I would later learn, is only virtuous when it protects your peace, not when it feeds someone else's cruelty. The first year after Richard's death was pure exhaustion. Running the company while dealing with family tension felt like walking through fog with a mirror in my hand, constantly checking if I still recognized myself. Then one evening, after another tense board meeting, Claire called Linda crying. "He's turning everyone against me," she said. "Dad's friends don't even return my calls anymore. Michael's poisoning the board."
Linda defended me, of course. But the seeds were planted.
That's what Claire was good at, planting doubts and letting them grow in silence. The next day, she showed up at our home with papers. "These need your signature," she said coldly. I skimmed through them, adjustments to the company's financial allocations. I pointed out an error in one of the sections. "This reallocation moves funds from our employee pension," I said. "That's not acceptable." She narrowed her eyes. "You're questioning my decision?" "I'm protecting the company," I said simply. She leaned closer. "You mean protecting yourself?" That was Claire. She could twist sunlight into shadow with a single phrase. Over time, her anger stopped being about the company. It became personal. Family dinners grew tense. She'd find subtle ways to humiliate me in front of others, reminding everyone that I was lucky to be part of their family. "Dad always said Linda needed someone stable," she'd say with a fake laugh. "I guess you fit that bill." I never responded. There's a kind of power in restraint, one she mistook for weakness. Linda saw the tension growing, but she didn't know how to stop it. She'd hold my hand under the table, give me a quiet look that said, "Please, let it go." And I always did. For her. But when Richard's company faced a major tax issue, one Claire caused by approving a vendor without review, she blamed me publicly. She called an emergency meeting, accusing me of negligence. I could have defended myself with proof, but I didn't. I knew where this was headed. I realized then that Claire didn't want justice or fairness. She wanted chaos, because in chaos, she could play the victim. That was the first time I spoke to Martin, my lawyer friend. Not to sue her. Not to fight. Just to understand what peace might look like if I stopped letting her define the rules. He said something that stuck with me. "Michael, sometimes the smartest move isn't fighting fire with fire, it's owning the ground the fire burns on." At the time, I didn't act. I wasn't ready. But the idea settled in me like a seed. Months later, when that plate shattered against the wall, I finally knew, the fire had burned long enough. And I was done standing still. If you've ever dealt with someone who hides cruelty behind a smile, you know how exhausting it can be. You start second-guessing yourself, replaying every word, every silence, wondering if you could have done something differently. That's what living around Claire felt like. A constant test of how long I could hold on to peace before I mistook it for surrender. After Richard's death, the company became her battleground. Every decision turned into a statement of dominance. She'd interrupt meetings to clarify my points, reword my memos, or dismiss my ideas only to present them weeks later as her own. At first, I ignored it. I believed professionalism would speak louder than pride. But I was naive. In corporate environments, especially family ones, perception is reality. And Claire understood perception better than anyone. One morning, she called for a full staff meeting. I remember walking into the conference room, the long oak table, the muted hum of the air conditioner, the stale scent of coffee. Everyone looked uneasy. She stood at the head of the table, perfectly composed. "I've reviewed the quarterly numbers," she began, "and I'm concerned. Some financial irregularities have been brought to my attention." I looked up, surprised. "Irregularities?" "Yes," she said smoothly, flipping through her papers. "Vendor payments that weren't properly documented. I assume you can explain." The room went still. I knew exactly what she was doing. She'd been the one approving vendor expenses for weeks. But by framing the question that way, she placed me on defense. I could have spoken up. Could have pulled out the emails proving my oversight. But instead, I stayed quiet. I looked her in the eye and said, "Of course. I'll clarify the details and send the full report by this afternoon." A few employees exchanged glances. Claire smiled, faintly victorious. She wanted me to react, to defend myself publicly so she could twist it into arrogance or guilt. But I'd learned that silence unnerves people like her more than words ever could. After the meeting, I returned to my office and sent her the complete documentation. Every transaction, every approval, every timestamp. I seat the board. Her reply came an hour later. Thank you for clarifying. Let's ensure better communication next time.
No apology. Just a deflection.
It was a small victory, quiet, invisible to most. But it mattered. It reminded me that calmness isn't passivity, it's preparation. Still, her games continued.
A week later, she called Linda.
I heard the conversation from the kitchen.
He's changing, she told her. Ever since Dad died, he's different. Cold. Controlling.
You need to be careful, Linda. Linda defended me, but I could tell it shook her. That was Claire's method, planting doubts in fertile soil. For a while, it worked. We started arguing over small things. Her visits became longer, her influence heavier. She'd arrive under the pretense of helping Linda around the house, but I knew what she was really doing, watching, listening, sewing. One night, after dinner, she found me in the study. You think you're clever, don't you? She said, standing in the doorway. I looked up from my laptop.
Excuse me.
This little act, the quiet husband who never argues. The rational one. You think it makes you superior. But it just makes you predictable. I closed the laptop slowly. I don't understand what you want, Claire. I want you to stop pretending you belong in this family, she said coldly. You're not one of us. You never were. Her words didn't sting the way she intended. They clarified things instead. This wasn't about the company. It wasn't even about Linda. It was about identity, hers, and the one she couldn't control in me. That night, I realized something important. I didn't have to win against Claire. I just had to stop playing her game. A month later, the board held its annual retreat at a mountain lodge. It was supposed to be a weekend of team building, strategy discussions, relaxation, and bonding. Claire used it as a stage. During dinner, after a few glasses of wine, she started sharing family stories. Harmless at first, then sharper. You know, she said to the group, Michael's a numbers guy, but he doesn't really get people. My dad used to say he's the kind of man who looks at a handshake and sees an equation. The table laughed awkwardly. I smiled. Maybe that's why you trust him with money, she added, not with hearts. That one landed. You could feel it. I took a sip of my drink, looked at her, and said quietly, I'd rather count integrity than favors. The laughter died down. She blinked, not expecting me to respond at all. That night, she avoided me completely. By the end of the retreat, word had quietly spread that Claire's behavior was unprofessional. She knew it too. You could see it in how she carried herself, stiffer, defensive. But she didn't stop. She just changed tactics. When her attempts at humiliation failed, she turned to sabotage. One morning, I got a call from a long-term client. Michael, he said, I got an email from your office. Someone offered to change our contract terms. Was that from you? I froze. We hadn't discussed any changes. When I checked, the email had been sent from Claire's assistant, on behalf of management. I confronted her privately. You went behind my back, I said. She crossed her arms. I made an executive decision. You altered a client contract without my signature. She smirked. You can always fix it later. You're good at cleaning up messes. That was the first time I truly lost my composure, not outwardly but inside. I walked out before I said something I'd regret. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept hearing Martin's words in my mind, own the ground the fire burns on. So I started documenting everything. Every meeting. Every decision. Every insult delivered with a smile. I didn't confront her again, I simply observed. Calmly. Quietly. Collecting the truth piece by piece. By winter, the company's board began noticing patterns. Claire's impulsive decisions, her hostility, her inability to work as part of a team. She sensed it too, and that made her dangerous. One Friday evening, She showed up at our house again. She claimed she wanted to clear the air. Linda, ever hopeful, invited her in. We sat in the living room, the air heavy with something unsaid. Claire started softly, almost sincere. Michael, I know we've had our differences. But I think we both want what's best for the company. I'd like to believe that, I said.
She nodded, her tone calm. Too calm.
Then maybe we should make some changes. You could step back a little. Let me handle the executive side.
You can keep your title, of course.
Just less involvement.
Linda frowned. Claire.
It's just a suggestion, Claire interrupted. I think it would make things smoother. People feel uncomfortable around Michael. That word, uncomfortable, was her favorite weapon. It turned opinion into evidence. I leaned back and looked at her. You're asking me to stay quiet while you run things your way. I'm asking you to know your place, she said flatly.
Linda gasped, but I stayed calm.
I looked her in the eye and said, Thank you for being honest, Claire. You've helped me make my decision. She smiled thinly, thinking she'd won.
Good.
I knew you'd see reason. I'll have my lawyer draft the necessary papers, I added. The color drained from her face. What papers? You'll see, I said simply. That night, after she left, Linda looked at me nervously. Michael, what are you planning?
I took her hand. Nothing cruel. Nothing loud. Just fairness.
In the following weeks, I met with Martin again. We went over the company's structure, my rights, and the legal boundaries that Claire had crossed. Every careless decision she made, every document she'd signed without my consent, left a trail. Michael, he said, scanning the evidence, this is more than negligence.
It's misconduct.
You have grounds to remove her from operational authority.
I don't want to destroy her, I said quietly.
Just protect what's left of Richard's legacy, and my peace.
He nodded. Then we'll do it right. No drama. No threats.
Just the law. And that's exactly what we did. For months, I said nothing to Claire. I continued working as usual, polite, composed, letting her believe I'd back down. Behind the scenes, Martin filed every motion, built every case, and prepared every document.
It was slow. Painfully slow.
But I'd learned patience the hard way, and now it was working for me, not against me. Then one morning, a formal letter arrived at Claire's office. Effective immediately, the board has initiated an internal review of executive conduct and management decisions. I wasn't in the room when she read it. But Linda told me later that Claire went pale, then furious. Michael did this, she hissed.
No.
Michael allowed the truth to reveal itself. That letter was the beginning of her unraveling, the first quiet shift in a long storm. But that, as I would learn, was only the start of how justice finds its way back. Not with rage, not with revenge, but with reason. I remember the morning that changed everything. Not because it was loud, but because it was silent. It was the kind of silence that carries weight, like the air right before a storm. Linda had left early to visit her sister, Emily. I knew she'd be gone for hours. I didn't say anything. I just nodded, kissed her forehead, and watched her drive away. For weeks, I'd been gathering my thoughts, and quietly my evidence. After the plate incident, I'd realized something painful but necessary. I couldn't win this by emotion. Emily thrived on chaos. She wanted a reaction, a confrontation, something to twist into proof that I was the selfish man she believed me to be. So I chose silence and patience. I reached out to my lawyer, a man named Richard Hale. Richard wasn't just a lawyer, he was an old friend from college. Calm, calculated, and discreet. When I told him what was happening, the insults, the manipulations, the growing interference from Emily, he leaned back in his chair and said something that stuck with me. Michael, revenge doesn't have to look like war. Sometimes, it's as quiet as a signature on the right page. That day, I made a decision. I wouldn't let anger write my story. I'd let strategy do it. The first step, boundaries in ink. The next week, I met with Richard again. Together, we reviewed all the property titles, joint accounts, and ownership documents. I'd inherited a small house from my father years before Linda and I married. I'd kept it as a rental property. Richard advised me to transfer ownership into a trust, one that couldn't be touched or claimed in any future disputes. Not because I didn't trust Linda, but because I didn't trust the influence Emily had over her. "You're not protecting this from your wife," Richard said quietly. "You're protecting it from the noise around her." That line hit me deep. He was right. Emily had started whispering to Linda that everything I owned should eventually be family property, by which she meant their family, not ours. Once the trust was established, I moved methodically, almost clinically, to create boundaries that Emily could no longer cross. I adjusted joint accounts so that my salary went into a private account, still accessible to Linda for household needs, but protected from anyone else's hands. I changed passwords, updated legal beneficiaries, and quietly asked my accountant to prepare a will, not out of fear but clarity. All the while, I stayed calm. I didn't confront Emily, didn't argue, didn't even mention her name when Linda vented about family misunderstandings. I listened, nodded, and kept the peace. Because peace, I realized, was not weakness, it was a weapon. The second step, a trap made of truth. A few weeks later, Linda told me Emily wanted to help with some paperwork regarding our property insurance. I agreed to meet her, but this time, I invited Richard too. We sat in the living room, the same place where the plate had once shattered on the floor. Emily smiled when she saw me. "Oh, you're here too?" I thought it was just a quick signature. Richard, polite as ever, opened his folder. "It's good that Mr. Collins is here," he said. "After all, every signature has a meaning, and sometimes consequences." Emily's smile faded just slightly. She tried to explain that she was simply helping Linda manage things better. I let her talk. Every word was a thread she tied around herself. When she paused, Richard gently interjected, "Mrs. Collins, it's admirable that you care about family management, but these documents, they would transfer ownership of shared assets. That's not just management. That's control." Emily's face stiffened. "I was just trying to help." I smiled, not mockingly, but quietly. "I know," I said. "But I think we'll handle things ourselves from now on." That meeting ended with no shouting, no insults, just the calm revelation that I saw through her game. That was the moment Emily began to lose power. The third step, silence in action. After that, Emily's tone shifted. She stopped visiting as often, though I could tell she still called Linda frequently. Linda's behavior changed too. She became distant, confused. There were moments when I could see her struggling between loyalty to her sister and love for me. I didn't pressure her. I simply lived with quiet consistency. I made breakfast, went to work, paid bills, fixed things around the house, and left space for her to think. It was the opposite of manipulation. It was patience in its purest form. One evening, while we were having dinner, she suddenly asked, "Did you talk to a lawyer about something?" I didn't flinch. "Yes," I said. "To protect our assets and make sure everything's in order." Her fork paused midair. "Why didn't you tell me?" "I didn't want to worry you," I said softly. "I just needed to make sure we're safe, from misunderstandings." There was a long pause. I could almost see her piecing together what that really meant. She looked down at her plate and whispered, "You mean Emily?" I said nothing. Silence sometimes speaks louder than words. She sighed. "I think I understand." That night, for the first time in months, Linda reached for my hand across the table. The fourth step, a lesson in control. A few weeks later, Emily called me directly, something she hadn't done since the day she threw that plate. Her tone was cold, controlled. "You think you're clever, don't you?" she said. "Protecting your money, talking to lawyers, making Linda doubt me?" I didn't answer immediately. I let the silence stretch. Then I said quietly, "Emily, I don't need to make anyone doubt you. You do that yourself."
There was a click, and she hung up.
That was the last time we spoke directly. But the consequences of that calm conversation rippled for months. Emily began to distance herself, perhaps out of pride, perhaps because she realized her influence was fading. Linda slowly reconnected with me, started to see things more clearly, not because I argued, but because the truth had space to breathe when manipulation stopped echoing. The letter that ended it all. One morning, a letter arrived from Richard's office. It was the finalized documentation, the trust, the will, the asset protection plan. Everything was legally sealed. I placed the envelope on the dining table and waited until Linda returned home. When she opened it and read the contents, her eyes filled with tears. "This is all in my name," she said softly. "Why would you do that after everything?" I smiled faintly.
"Because I want peace, Linda. Not power. You're my wife.
And no one, not even family, should make you feel torn between love and loyalty." She cried then, quietly, deeply. And I realized that forgiveness sometimes comes not from saying sorry, but from showing security.
That night, she called Emily.
I didn't hear the full conversation, but I could tell from her tone, calm, steady, no longer defensive, that she was setting boundaries for the first time. I sat outside on the porch, watching the sunset. The house was quiet again, but this time, it wasn't heavy silence.
It was peaceful.
It was the sound of balance returning. Months passed quietly after the letter. No shouting, no confrontations, no slammed doors. It was strange, how peace, when it finally arrives, feels almost foreign. You find yourself waiting for chaos out of habit. But when it doesn't come, you begin to realize you were living on edge for far too long. I started noticing small changes first.
Linda smiled more.
She cooked without tension in her shoulders. We'd sit on the porch after dinner, talk about her art classes, my work, or sometimes just the sound of the night. She stopped mentioning Emily.
Completely.
It wasn't avoidance, it was release. Like she had finally let go of something heavy she'd been carrying for years. One evening, while we were watching the sunset, she said softly, "You know, I used to think you were distant. That you didn't care about my family. But now I see you were just trying to protect us." I didn't say anything for a moment. Then I said, "Sometimes caring looks like distance. Sometimes love means staying calm when you want to scream." She nodded, resting her head on my shoulder. That quiet moment, that small gesture, felt like redemption. 1. Emily's fall without my hand. News of Emily's troubles reached us through Linda's cousin one afternoon. Apparently, Emily and her husband had gotten into financial trouble. Poor investments, mounting debts, and a business partner who'd run off with most of their savings. When I heard it, I didn't smile. I didn't gloat. I simply sat back and let the moment pass through me like a wave. Because revenge, I'd come to learn, isn't about seeing someone fall. It's about realizing you no longer need them to fall for you to rise. Linda was shaken by the news. "She's always been so proud," she whispered. "I can't imagine how this must feel for her." I said quietly, "Pride falls harder than truth ever does." For a few days, Linda seemed torn. I could see the compassion in her. The same compassion that once made her blind to her sister's manipulation. But this time, there was balance. She didn't rush to fix Emily's life. She didn't write checks or make calls. Instead, she said, maybe she needs to understand what it feels like to face consequences. And that right there was growth.
2. The visit.
A few weeks later, Emily came to see us. It was a Sunday morning. Clear skies, warm breeze, the kind of day that doesn't warn you something unexpected is coming. When I opened the door, I barely recognized her. The confident sharpness in her expression was gone. She looked tired, smaller somehow. "Michael," she said quietly, "is Linda home?" I nodded and stepped aside. Linda appeared from the kitchen, hesitating for a moment before walking toward her sister. They stood there in silence. No hugs, no tears, just two people standing at the edge of all the damage between them. Finally, Emily spoke.
I came to apologize.
Not just for the things I said, but for how I treated you both. Her voice cracked slightly. You didn't deserve that. I thought I was protecting my sister from you, but really, I was just jealous. Linda's eyes filled with tears.
Jealous? Of what? Emily looked down. Of your peace.
Of how he treats you. I've never had that. So I tried to ruin it. There was a long silence. You could feel years of resentment and misunderstanding dissolve in that one confession.
I didn't say much.
I didn't need to. My role in that moment wasn't to speak, it was to witness. Linda forgave her, right there in the living room. Not because Emily deserved it, but because Linda needed it. Forgiveness, I realized, isn't about giving someone a free pass, it's about freeing yourself from their weight. 3. Closure through grace. After that day, Emily visited a few times.
She was careful, humble, even kind.
She didn't interfere or advise. She simply showed up, helped in the kitchen, made small talk. The three of us even shared a quiet dinner one evening. It wasn't the same as before, and that was a good thing.
There was honesty now.
A fragile honesty, but it was real. At one point, Emily turned to me and said, "You had every right to throw me out of your lives."
But you didn't.
I smiled gently. Throwing you out would have been easy. Living peacefully without needing to prove anything, that was harder. She nodded, eyes glistening. You're a better man than I gave you credit for. I shrugged softly.
Pain changes people.
It either makes you bitter or wiser. I just tried to choose the second.
She didn't reply.
She didn't need to.
4. The letter of peace.
That night, after Emily left, I sat at my desk and opened the old file I'd kept, the one with all the documentation, notes, and legal records. It had once symbolized defense,
protection,
strategy. Now, it just felt heavy,
unnecessary.
So I wrote a letter. Dear Richard, I want to thank you for everything you helped me with. But I think it's time to close the file. The purpose was never to fight, it was to bring peace. And I think peace has finally come. With gratitude.
Michael.
I sealed it, placed it in an envelope, and left it by the door for the next morning's mail. It felt like a full circle, the same kind of silence as the day I'd started this journey, but lighter, cleaner.
5. What I learned.
Sometimes I sit alone on that same porch where everything began, where anger once lived quietly under my skin.
The wind feels softer now. The world quieter.
And I've learned that revenge doesn't always need a villain to punish. Sometimes, it's about becoming the kind of person who no longer reacts, who no longer breaks when provoked. Emily still calls Linda now and then. They're rebuilding, slowly, carefully. I don't interfere. I don't forget, either. But forgiveness isn't forgetting. It's remembering without resentment. When I look at Linda laughing on the porch, her hair catching the evening light, I realize I didn't just win a battle. I rebuilt something that could have easily been lost: respect, peace, and trust. The same things Emily once tried to break. 6. Final conversation. One evening, months later, Emily and I found ourselves alone on the porch. Linda had gone inside to grab dessert. She looked out at the garden and said quietly, "You're not the man I thought you were." I smiled faintly.
Neither am I. I've changed. She turned to me.
Do you hate me?
I shook my head. No. I did once, for a short while. But hate is heavy.
I learned to put it down. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening.
You're lucky.
Not everyone learns that.
I wasn't lucky, I said softly. I was patient.
And with that, there was nothing more to say. That night, after everyone went to bed, I stood by the window, looking at the stars. So much had happened in that house: betrayal, anger, patience, and peace. But as I stood there, I felt no bitterness.
Only calm.
Sometimes justice doesn't come with punishment, it comes with understanding. And sometimes the best revenge isn't proving them wrong, it's showing them you've moved on, and you're still standing tall. It's been nearly 2 years since that morning, the one when a plate flew across my kitchen and shattered against the wall, breaking more than just porcelain. Sometimes, I still remember the sound. Not because it scares me, but because it reminds me of how far we've come. Life has returned to a rhythm I once thought we'd lost forever. Linda and I wake up early, take morning walks, talk about the small things: what to cook, which flowers to plant, what movie to watch.
It's ordinary.
And that's what makes it beautiful. There are no more whispered arguments, no silent dinners. Our home feels like a home again, not a battlefield waiting for the next accusation. And when I look at Linda now, I don't see the woman torn between loyalty and love. I see someone who found her balance. Someone who learned that peace doesn't mean pleasing everyone. 1. A quiet morning of reflection. This morning, as I sit with my coffee on the porch, I think about how easily life can twist when pride and ego take the wheel. Emily's words still echo faintly in my memory: "You're selfish."
At the time, they hurt. Deeply.
Because I had spent my whole life believing that being calm, patient, and fair was enough. But I learned that even good people need boundaries. That silence without direction can turn into permission for others to walk over you. So I found a new kind of silence, one that came with purpose. I didn't raise my voice, but I raised my standards. I didn't seek revenge, but I sought clarity. And in doing so, I realized that true strength doesn't always roar. Sometimes it simply endures.
2. Linda's transformation.
Linda changed too. She started painting again, something she'd given up years ago when life got too busy and too loud. Her studio sits by the window now, and every evening, I see her working quietly, covered in a splash of colors. There's peace in her posture, the same peace that was missing when Emily's opinions filled our home. One night, as I watched her paint, she looked at me and said, "You know, Michael, if you hadn't stayed calm, I might have lost everything: our home, our marriage, my peace." I smiled and said, "If I hadn't stayed calm, we would have lost it.
Both of us."
She laughed softly.
"You're right.
You always were." For the first time in a long time, she looked free, not because someone else had lost, but because we had finally stopped fighting battles that didn't belong to us. 3. The day I let go completely. A few weeks ago, Richard, my lawyer and friend, invited me for lunch. We talked about work, the weather, the usual things men our age talk about when life slows down. Then he leaned forward and said, "You handled it better than most, Michael."
Most people fight louder. I chuckled. Maybe.
But loud fights don't build peace.
He nodded.
You know, when you first came to me, I thought you wanted to destroy your sister-in-law.
But you didn't.
You just wanted your life back.
He was right.
I never wanted destruction, just peace. When I got home that afternoon, I went through my drawers and found the last piece of paperwork from the trust and legal documents we'd set up. For a long time, I kept it as a reminder, a symbol of strength. But that day I tore it up. Not out of anger, out of closure. Because I no longer needed to protect myself from the past. The lesson had already done its work. 4. The visit that closed the circle. One spring afternoon, Emily visited again. It was unexpected, but not unwelcome. She brought a basket of apples from her garden, a small gesture, but one that carried meaning. We sat in the garden, under the shade of the old oak tree, sipping lemonade. Linda joined us after a while, and for a few moments, everything felt easy, normal. Emily turned to me and said, "I've been seeing a therapist. Trying to fix some things, inside."
I nodded. That's brave.
She smiled faintly. I wish I'd done it sooner. Maybe I wouldn't have hurt the people who cared about me. I looked at her for a long moment and said, You can't change the past, Emily. But you can make sure the past doesn't keep changing you. She smiled again, eyes glistening. You always have these calm answers, don't you? I laughed quietly.
Not always.
I just stopped letting anger do the talking. Before she left, she said something that stayed with me. Thank you for not giving up on Linda. And for not turning her against me. You had every reason to. I simply replied, some battles aren't worth winning if they cost you your peace. When she drove away, I watched the car disappear down the road and felt something inside me settle completely.
The circle had closed.
5. The lesson that remains. Looking back now, I see that everything, the insults, the manipulation, the silence, the strategy, had one purpose, to teach me that emotional strength doesn't come from control, but from restraint. Revenge doesn't need to burn. Sometimes it just needs to illuminate. Emily lost her arrogance. Linda found her independence. And I found my stillness again. Every person learns something, not through punishment, but through consequence. That's the difference between vengeance and justice. Vengeance demands pain, justice allows truth to breathe. And truth, when left alone, does its work better than any plan or speech ever could. 6. A final reflection. As I close this chapter of my life, I often think about that one word, selfish. She threw it at me like a knife, believing it would wound me. And maybe at that time, it did. But over the years, I realized something. Being selfish about your peace isn't wrong. It's necessary. Because if you don't protect your peace, someone else will use it as their playground. If you don't set boundaries, you'll drown in someone else's storm. And if you don't value your silence, others will fill it with their noise. So, yes, maybe I was selfish. But I was selfish for the right reasons.
For love. For clarity. For peace.